The security cameras outside the Hells Angels Sacramento clubhouse captured everything in brutal, high-definition clarity that would later be studied by federal investigators in courtrooms, and analyzed frame by people trying to understand how a single act of humiliation triggered 48 hours of violence that left 23 people dead and reshaped the criminal landscape of Northern California. At exactly 2:34 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 black SUVs pulled up to the clubhouse with engines running, doors opening in coordinated precision that suggested military training or extensive planning. 12 men emerged wearing masks depicting serpents, carrying weapons that ranged from machetes to semi-automatic rifles, moving with the confidence of people who believed they were untouchable. In the center of this formation, they dragged Mikey Hayes, 26 years old, full patch member of the Hells Angels and Sergeant-at-Arms of the Sacramento chapter, his face already swollen from beatings, his hands zip-tied behind his back, blood dripping from a split lip onto his leather cut that bore the patches he'd earned through 5 years of loyalty and sacrifice. Dane "Ghost" Hayes was inside the clubhouse reviewing financial reports with his treasurer, Kevin Razor Thompson, when the first brother came running through the door, his face pale with shock and rage, words tumbling out so fast they barely made sense. "President, they've got Mikey outside. Cartel, Serpiente Cartel. They're making him kneel in the street. They've got guns on him, and they're saying if anyone comes out, they'll execute him right there." The words hit Dane like physical blows, each syllable registering in his brain but somehow not connecting to reality because this couldn't be happening. Not to his son. Not in front of his own clubhouse in broad daylight in a residential neighborhood where children played and normal people lived normal lives. He'd spent 28 years in the Hells Angels, had risen to chapter president through combination of strategic thinking and willingness to do violence when necessary, had made enemies and buried brothers and survived wars that should have killed him. But nothing in those decades of experience had prepared him for the sight of his son, his only child, being forced to his knees in the street while masked men with rifles ensured that no one could intervene without triggering a massacre. Through the clubhouse window, Dane watched as Hector El Serpiente Ramirez removed his mask deliberately, wanting to be recognized, wanting the Angels to know exactly who was responsible for this violation. Hector was 44 years old, had worked his way up through Serpiente cartel ranks by being more brutal and more calculating than his competitors, and his presence here meant this wasn't some random act by low-level enforcers. This was a message from the top. An intentional provocation designed to achieve something beyond simple revenge or territorial dispute. Hector pulled a knife from his belt, the blade catching sunlight and gleaming with a brightness that seemed obscene given the context, and held it to Mikey's throat while speaking loud enough for his voice to carry through the closed clubhouse door. "Hells Angels, you hear me? This is what happens when you steal from Serpiente Cartel. This is what disrespect earns you. Your sergeant-at-arms, your president's son, he kneels before us like a dog because that's what he is. That's what all of you are. Dogs who forgot their place. If you're ready to witness how a father's humiliation and rage transformed into the most calculated campaign of destruction the criminal underworld has ever seen, how a single moment of public shame triggered a war that exposed corruption reaching into law enforcement and judicial systems, hit that like button and subscribe because this story will take you into the darkest corners of pride, revenge, and the terrible price of discovering that sometimes your real enemies wear badges and hide behind the institutions designed to protect society. The next 48 hours would see the mobilization of not just the Hells Angels, but 5 other motorcycle clubs in a coordinated assault that would leave bodies in the streets, buildings burning, and force federal authorities to acknowledge corruption they'd been ignoring for years. Frank "Bull" Morrison grabbed Dane's arm before he could move toward the door, the vice president's grip iron strong despite being confined to a wheelchair after losing both legs below the knee to a Viet Cong mine in 1971. Bull was 55 years old, had been Dane's VP for 12 years and his best friend for 25, and he understood that what was happening outside required strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. "Brother, you go out there. They kill Mikey, and probably you too. They want you to react. They want you to give them justification for whatever they're planning next. We need to think, not charge. But Dane could only stare at his son kneeling in the street, at the knife pressed against his throat, at the humiliation being inflicted on a man who'd done nothing except be born to a Hell's Angel and choose to follow in his father's path. Mikey had earned his full patch 3 years ago after a prospect period that had been deliberately harder than most because Dane had insisted that his son receive no special treatment, no shortcuts, no suggestions that family connections mattered more than merit and loyalty. The young man had accepted every challenge, every dangerous assignment, every test of courage with a determination that had earned genuine respect from brothers who'd initially been skeptical about the president's kid joining the club. Last month, Mikey had been voted Sergeant-at-Arms, responsible for club security and discipline, a position of trust that reflected how completely he'd proven himself. Now that same man knelt in the street with a knife at his throat while his father watched through a window, paralyzed by the knowledge that any action he took might result in his son's immediate execution. Hector kept the knife pressed to Mikey's throat for another 30 seconds that felt like hours, his eyes scanning the clubhouse windows, clearly hoping someone would try to intervene and give him excuse to escalate. When no one emerged, when the Angels demonstrated the discipline of not walking into an obvious trap, Hector's expression shifted to something that might have been respect or might have been disappointment. "Smart," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "Smarter than I expected. But understand this message. Serpiente Cartel owns these streets now. Your time is over. This humiliation is mercy compared to what comes next if you don't accept the new reality." He removed the knife from Mikey's throat, and for a moment Dane felt relief flooding through him so powerfully it made his knees weak. Then Hector pistol-whipped Mikey across the face with casual brutality that spoke of violence being routine, normal, barely worth noticing. Mikey collapsed to the pavement, blood pooling beneath his head, and Hector kicked him twice in the ribs before gesturing to his men. They loaded back into their SUVs with the same military precision they'd displayed arriving, leaving Mikey lying in the street like discarded trash, the entire confrontation having lasted less than 4 minutes. The moment their vehicles turned the corner and disappeared from sight, the clubhouse erupted as 20 Angels poured into the street, Dane reaching his son first and dropping to his knees beside the unconscious young man. "Mikey, can you hear me? Son, stay with me. Somebody call an ambulance." Mikey's face was a mess of blood and swelling, his breathing shallow and irregular, but his eyes flickered open and found his father's face. "Sorry, Dad," he whispered, blood bubbling at his lips. "I'm sorry. They grabbed me at the gas station. I didn't see them coming. I'm sorry I let you down." The words broke something in Dane's chest, the realization that his son was apologizing for being victimized, for surviving, for the humiliation that had been inflicted on him. Lisa Hayes received the call about her son while she was teaching an 11th grade English class at Sacramento High School, her phone buzzing insistently until she finally excused herself to check what emergency could possibly justify interrupting class time. The voice on the other end belonged to Bull Morrison, and his careful, measured tone told her everything she needed to know before he'd finished his first sentence. "Lisa, it's Bull. Michael's been hurt. He's alive, he's conscious, but you need to get to Mercy General Hospital right now. Dane's with him. I'm handling everything here, but you need to be with your son." Lisa had divorced Dane 8 years ago when Michael was 18, unable to continue living with the constant fear that defined being married to a Hell's Angel, unable to watch her son being drawn into the same life that had consumed his father. She'd fought against Michael patching into the club, had begged him to go to college instead, to choose any other path. But Michael had wanted nothing more than to earn his father's respect and the brotherhood that defined the Angels, and Lisa had been forced to accept a reality she couldn't change. Now her worst fears had materialized in a hospital emergency room where she found her only child lying on a gurney with a concussion, 3 cracked ribs, facial lacerations requiring 28 stitches, and eyes that held a shame she'd never seen before. "They made me kneel, Mom," Michael said when she took his hand, his voice barely above a whisper. In front of the clubhouse. In front of everyone. They put a knife to my throat and made me kneel while they called me a dog. Called all of us dogs. And I couldn't do anything. I couldn't fight back. I just had to kneel there and take it. Lisa wanted to tell him that surviving wasn't shameful, that he'd done exactly what he needed to do to stay alive, that the only people who should feel shame were the animals who'd brutalized him. But she could see in his eyes that her son's sense of identity had been shattered by those 4 minutes in the street, that something fundamental had been broken that might never fully heal. She looked past Michael to where Dane stood against the far wall, his face a mask of controlled fury that she recognized from their marriage as the expression that preceded calculated violence. "What are you going to do?" she asked him, already knowing the answer but needing to hear him say it. "I'm going to make them pay," Dane said quietly, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I'm going to find everyone involved in what happened to Mikey, and I'm going to make them understand that you don't touch a Hell's Angel's son without consequences that will haunt you for whatever short time you have left on this earth." Lisa felt tears burning in her eyes, tears of frustration and fear and anger at a world where her son could be brutalized in broad daylight, and the only available response was more violence, more revenge, more of the endless cycle that had defined her marriage and destroyed her family. And how many more sons will die because of that, Dane? How many more mothers will stand in hospital rooms or at gravesites because you need to prove something to a cartel that probably doesn't even remember Michael's name? The question hung between them, unanswerable and accusatory, forcing Dane to confront the reality that his son had been targeted specifically because of who his father was, that Michael's suffering was collateral damage in a war that had nothing to do with anything he'd personally done. But acknowledging that truth didn't change the fundamental equation. In the world Dane inhabited, the world he'd chosen and raised his son to join, allowing this humiliation to stand without response, would mark them as weak, vulnerable, acceptable targets for anyone who wanted to test their boundaries. The mathematics of respect and violence that governed his life demanded retaliation, regardless of what that cost him or his family, or the 20 other families who might lose sons in the conflict to come. Kevin Razor Thompson sat in his apartment 3 miles from the clubhouse, his hands shaking as he poured his 4th whiskey of the afternoon, trying to quiet the voices in his head that screamed he was a traitor, that he'd sold out a brother, that the blood on Mikey's face was on his hands as surely as if he'd held the knife himself. The gambling debts had started small, just a few $1,000s at a casino in Reno, losses that Kevin had been certain he could recover through smarter betting and better luck. But debts had a way of compounding through interest and desperation, and within 6 months Kevin owed $180,000 to a loan shark who'd turned out to have connections to Serpiente Cartel. The collections had been civilized at first, just phone calls and polite reminders about the importance of honoring obligations. Then they'd become less civilized. Threats to his family, photographs of his daughter leaving school, suggestions about what happened to people who didn't pay their debts on time. When Captain James Walsh had approached him 3 weeks ago with an offer, it had seemed like salvation. Walsh, a 22-year veteran of Sacramento PD and commander of the Narcotics Division, had connections throughout the criminal world and had offered to clear Kevin's entire debt in exchange for one simple piece of information: when and where Mikey Hayes would be vulnerable. "The cartel wants to send a message to the Angels," Walsh had explained with the casual authority of someone accustomed to balancing multiple criminal relationships. "They don't want to kill anyone, just deliver a lesson about respecting boundaries. Give me Mikey's schedule for 1 day and your debt disappears. No one gets seriously hurt, everyone learns where the lines are, and you get your life back." Kevin had wanted to believe it would be that simple, that providing Mikey's gas station stop schedule would result in nothing more serious than a conversation or minor scuffle. He'd told himself that as club treasurer he was in a unique position to prevent larger violence by enabling smaller violence, that he was actually protecting the club by allowing this controlled message rather than letting tensions escalate into all-out war. But watching Mikey being forced to his knees, seeing the blood and the humiliation and the soul-deep shame in a brother's eyes, Kevin understood that he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. He'd betrayed his club, had sold out the president's son, had participated in something that would haunt him for whatever time he had left. His phone buzzed with a text from Walsh. "Good work. Debt cleared as promised. Now we need to talk about your continued cooperation." Kevin stared at the message, understanding with crystalline clarity that this wouldn't be the last time Walsh demanded information, that he'd been transformed from occasional informant into permanent asset, that his choices now were to continue betraying his brothers or to confess his treachery and face whatever justice the club decided to dispense. Either path led to destruction, but at least one path involved telling the truth and accepting consequences rather than compounding the betrayal with continued lies. Agent Rebecca Foster watched the clubhouse security footage for the 5th time in her DEA office, her professional analyst's mind cataloging details while her mother's heart broke for Michael Hayes and his family. She'd been investigating Serpiente Cartel for 3 years, ever since her own daughter Emma had been kidnapped from a San Diego shopping mall parking lot at age 8 by cartel members who'd mistakenly believed Emma's father was a federal informant. The ransom negotiations had lasted 6 agonizing days, then abruptly ceased when the cartel had discovered their mistake. Emma's body had never been found, no arrests had ever been made, and Rebecca had been transformed from a narcotics investigator into a woman consumed by a single purpose: destroying every person and organization connected to her daughter's death. Her superiors had wanted to remove her from cartel cases due to conflict of interest, but Rebecca had convinced them that her motivation made her more effective, not less, that she understood these animals in ways that detached analysts never could. What made this particular assault interesting from an investigative standpoint was how carefully orchestrated it had been, how the cartel had known exactly when and where to grab Michael Hayes, how they'd timed the attack for maximum witness impact while ensuring no law enforcement would intervene quickly enough to prevent it. This level of intelligence suggested inside information, either from within the Angels themselves or from law enforcement sources with access to surveillance or informants. Rebecca pulled up the cartel's organizational chart on her secondary monitor, studying the faces and names of known Serpiente members. Hector Ramirez was listed as an enforcer, muscle, someone who followed orders rather than giving them, which meant someone higher in the organization had authorized this very public humiliation, someone calculating enough to understand that forcing the Angels to either respond with overwhelming violence or accept emasculation was a win-win proposition for the cartel. Either the Angels destroyed themselves through excessive retaliation that would bring federal attention, or they lost credibility and territory through weakness. Diego Ramirez sat in his Uncle Hector's apartment watching news coverage of the assault, his stomach churning with mixture of shame and rage that had defined his existence since his mother's murder 6 months ago. Maria Ramirez had been Hector's younger sister and Diego's entire world, a woman who'd worked 3 jobs to keep her son away from the cartel life that had consumed the rest of their family. She'd been killed by Victoria Salazar's personal enforcer as punishment for Hector's perceived disloyalty, shot twice in the head while leaving her night shift at a hotel where she cleaned rooms. The message had been clear: no one was safe, family meant nothing. Only absolute obedience to Victoria mattered. Hector had responded by demonstrating his loyalty through increasingly brutal enforcement actions, trying to prove that Maria's death would not be in vain, that he could still be trusted. But Diego knew the truth that his uncle either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. Hector was being used, positioned as the visible face of cartel operations while Victoria remained hidden and protected, and when Hector had outlived his usefulness, he would be eliminated just as casually as Maria had been. The Sacramento clubhouse war room filled within 2 hours of Mikey's assault with representatives from not just the Hells Angels, but 5 other motorcycle clubs who viewed the public humiliation as an attack on the entire outlaw culture. Bull Morrison coordinated from his wheelchair at the head of the table, his Vietnam tactical experience transforming raw fury into strategic planning. We've identified 22 Serpiente cartel operations within 100 miles, Bull announced, spreading maps and surveillance photos across the table. Distribution houses, money operations, even Captain Walsh's home address because our sources confirm he's been on cartel payroll for at least 2 years. The revelation that Sacramento PD's narcotics commander was corrupt drew angry murmurs but surprised no one. Corruption was currency in their world, expected and planned for. Dane stood at the window watching his son sleep in the hospital bed down the hall, his mind replaying those 4 minutes when Mikey had knelt with a knife at his throat over and over like a loop he couldn't stop. Marcus Wrench Chen, a 23-year-old prospect, approached hesitantly with information that would change everything. "President, I need to tell you something that's going to hurt. Yesterday, I saw Kevin meeting with Captain Walsh at a coffee shop on J Street. They were there for 30 minutes, looked real serious, and Kevin handed him what looked like papers." Marcus's voice shook not from fear, but from the PTSD that gripped him whenever he witnessed authority figures being trusted. His own father had been a respected minister who'd molested Marcus and 12 other children for years before being caught. The room fell absolutely silent as the implication settled over everyone present. Kevin Razor Thompson, club treasurer for 6 years, trusted brother, was meeting secretly with a corrupt cop who had cartel connections. Bull's weathered face darkened with fury. "Get Kevin here. Now. Don't tell him why, just tell him we need him for club business." Within 20 minutes, Kevin walked through the door with the false confidence of a man who believed his betrayal remained hidden, his smile fading instantly when he saw every angel in the room staring at him with expressions that promised violence. "Brothers, what's going on?" Kevin tried, his voice already trembling because he understood perfectly what was going on. Dane crossed the room with controlled purpose, his movements carrying the inevitability of execution. "Marcus saw you with Captain Walsh yesterday. Want to tell us what you were discussing?" Kevin's face went pale as every ounce of blood seemed to drain from his head. His mouth opened and closed several times before words finally emerged. "I can explain. I had gambling debts. Walsh said he'd clear them if I gave him Mikey's schedule for 1 day. He said no one would get seriously hurt, just a message about boundaries. I didn't know they'd do what they did. You have to believe me. I never wanted Mikey hurt like that." The confession hung in the air like poison, contaminating everything it touched. Bull pulled his pistol from his lap with movements made smooth through 50 years of handling weapons, the barrel pointing steadily at Kevin's chest. "You gave them my nephew. You gave them our sergeant at arms. You gave them the president's son. For gambling debts." His finger tightened on the trigger and Kevin dropped to his knees, hands raised, tears streaming down his face. "Please, Bull. Please. I know I fucked up. I know it's unforgivable. But I have a daughter, man. I have a little girl who needs her father. Don't make her grow up without me." The plea might have carried more weight if everyone in the room hadn't immediately thought about how Kevin's concern for his own daughter hadn't prevented him from setting up someone else's son. Dane placed his hand on Bull's arm, gently pushing the weapon down. "Not here. Not like this. We do this right." He turned to face Kevin directly, and the expression on Dane's face was worse than any weapon could have been. Not rage, not hatred, but the complete absence of the brotherhood and trust that had once existed between them. "Kevin, you're out bad. You're no longer a member of this club. You're no longer protected by this club. And you're going to help us fix what you broke, and then you're going to disappear and pray we never see you again." Kevin's relief at not being immediately executed was visible, but so was his understanding that exile from the club meant becoming a target for both the angels who'd never forgive his betrayal and the cartel who'd eliminate him as a loose end. Captain James Walsh sat in his office at Sacramento PD, reviewing reports and feeling satisfied with how cleanly the Mikey Hayes operation had executed. The humiliation had been public enough to force the Angels to either overreact or accept weakness, either outcome beneficial to Walsh's complex web of relationships that saw him taking money from Serpiente Cartel while also feeding intelligence to Agent Foster's DEA investigation while simultaneously protecting his own criminal operations. Walsh was 49 years old, 22 years on the force, and had long ago abandoned any illusion that law enforcement was about justice rather than power and profit. His phone buzzed with a call from Victoria Salazar, the woman who actually ran Serpiente Cartel despite letting Hector serve as its public face. The Hayes humiliation was perfectly executed, Victoria said in her precise, educated English that always surprised people expecting street vernacular. Now we watch and wait. If they retaliate violently, we document everything and use it to justify expanded operations. If they accept the message, we move into their territory unopposed. What Walsh didn't tell Victoria, what he'd been carefully concealing through his various criminal relationships, was that he'd already provided the evidence of Angel's retaliation to Agent Foster's DEA investigation. His plan was elegant. Let the Angels and the cartel destroy each other through escalating violence, feed intelligence to the DEA that would allow them to arrest whoever survived, then position himself as the hero cop who'd brought down both organizations. The fact that he'd orchestrated much of the conflict himself would remain buried in layers of complexity that investigators would never fully untangle. Except that Walsh had made one critical miscalculation. He'd underestimated how thoroughly Agent Rebecca Foster had been investigating him alongside her investigation of the cartel. Foster sat in a surveillance van 3 blocks from Walsh's house, listening through high-quality headphones to the conversation between Walsh and Victoria that the wiretap on his home phone was capturing. She'd suspected Walsh's corruption for 8 months, but had lacked concrete evidence until Kevin Thompson's meeting yesterday had been photographed by DEA surveillance teams monitoring known cartel meeting spots. Now she had Walsh coordinating with cartel leadership. Now she had probable cause for warrants that would tear apart his life and expose the network of corruption he'd been building. But Foster also understood that arresting Walsh immediately would alert Victoria and cause her to disappear before Foster could get close. Victoria Salazar was the person Foster truly wanted, the woman whose organization had taken her daughter, and she was willing to let Walsh's corruption continue a bit longer if it meant getting Victoria into a position where arrest was inevitable. Diego Ramirez made his decision while watching his uncle clean the knife he'd held to Mikey Hayes' throat, the blade still carrying traces of blood that Hector polished away with almost loving care. "Uncle, why did Victoria order you to humiliate the Angel's son instead of just killing him? What's the strategic benefit of public humiliation versus elimination?" Hector looked up from his knife with an expression of surprise that his nephew was questioning tactics. "Victoria says public humiliation is more effective than death. Death creates martyrs and clarity of purpose. Humiliation creates shame and internal division. The Angels will tear themselves apart arguing about how to respond, and we can exploit that chaos." Diego nodded as if this made sense, but his mind was calculating something else entirely. His uncle had become a tool, used by Victoria to do her dirty work while she remained protected and distant. When this war with the Angels escalated, Hector would be the one the feds arrested or the Angels killed, while Victoria would vanish into her protected networks of corrupt officials and offshore accounts. Frank "Bull" Morrison made the call that would cost him his life at 3:17 a.m. when Dane was sleeping fitfully in a chair beside Mikey's hospital bed. Bull had been reviewing Kevin's cooperation testimony for hours, connecting dots that painted a picture more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. "Brother, you need to hear this. Kevin didn't just give up Mikey's location. He's been feeding Walsh information about club operations for 6 months. Every shipment we've moved, every meeting we've had with other clubs, every plan we've made, Walsh has known about all of it. We've been completely compromised. Dane felt his blood run cold as the implications cascaded through his mind. Every move they'd made for 6 months had been watched, anticipated, potentially manipulated by Walsh and through him by the cartel. They hadn't just been outplayed tactically. They'd been playing a game where their opponent knew every card in their hand. "There's more," Bull continued, his voice grim. "Walsh has been coordinating with Agent Foster. I found encrypted emails that Kevin accessed that show Walsh feeding intelligence to the DEA about us while taking money from the cartel and protecting his own operations. This isn't just about corruption, Dane. This is about Walsh using all of us, Angels, Cartel, DEA, as pieces in some game where he's the only one who knows all the rules." The revelation was staggering in its scope, suggesting a level of manipulation and long-term planning that went far beyond simple corruption. Walsh wasn't just a dirty cop taking bribes. He was an architect of conflict, deliberately creating chaos he could profit from and control. "We need to meet with Agent Foster," Dane said finally. "If Walsh is playing her too, she needs to know. And if she's part of his game, we need to know that." Bull had just ended the call when his apartment door exploded inward, the frame splintering under the impact of a battering ram wielded by men in tactical gear. Captain Walsh entered behind the tactical team, his weapon drawn, his badge displayed on his chest in a mockery of legitimate police work. "Frank Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, drug trafficking, and about 40 other charges we'll add as we go through your life." Bull's hand moved toward the pistol on his lap, but Walsh was faster, his weapon already aimed at the disabled veteran's chest. "Don't. I will put you down right here and call it justified. Give me an excuse, Bull. Please give me an excuse." Bull slowly raised his hands, his face showing not fear but calculation, his mind processing what Walsh's presence here meant about the information Bull had just shared with Dane. "You're not really arresting me," Bull said quietly. "Kevin told you that we figured out he was your informant. You're here to make sure I don't share what I learned about your games with Walsh and the DEA and the cartel. You're tying up loose ends." Walsh smiled, an expression without warmth or humanity. "You always were too smart for your own good, Bull. Yeah, Kevin called me 20 minutes ago, said you were connecting dots I needed to stay disconnected. Can't have you talking to Agent Foster. Can't have you exposing the beautiful complexity of what I've built here. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to resist arrest, going to pull that weapon on your lap, and I'm going to shoot you in self-defense. Tragic death of a disabled veteran, but necessary to protect my officers from an armed criminal." Bull's response was instant and unexpected. He triggered the remote connected to his phone that sent everything Kevin had confessed, and every document Bull had compiled to 5 different email addresses, including Agent Foster's, Dane's, the FBI regional director's, the Sacramento Bee newspaper, and his own lawyer. "Already sent, Walsh. Everything. Your corruption, your games, your manipulation of all of us. It's out there now, and killing me doesn't stop it." For just a moment, Walsh's composed mask slipped, genuine fear and rage flashing across his face. Then he shot Bull 3 times in the chest, the sound of the gunfire deafening in the small apartment. And Frank "Bull" Morrison, decorated Vietnam veteran and Hells Angels vice president, died in his wheelchair surrounded by corrupt cops who would write reports calling him a dangerous criminal who'd forced them to defend themselves. Agent Foster was reading the emails Bull had sent when the notification came through her official channels that Frank Morrison had been killed while resisting arrest. She stared at her computer screen, at the documented evidence of Walsh's corruption that Morrison had compiled in his final hours, and understood with crystalline clarity that Walsh was eliminating witnesses and probably coming for her next. She grabbed her go bag, the one every agent kept ready for emergency deployments, and was heading for her car when Walsh's tactical team surrounded her vehicle. "Agent Foster, we need you to come with us," Walsh said with his weapon drawn but not quite pointed at her. "Internal Affairs has some questions about your investigation methods and possible misconduct." Foster's hand was on her own weapon, her mind calculating odds and finding them impossibly bad. 5 armed officers, all loyal to Walsh or too corrupt to matter, against her alone in a parking garage with no witnesses. "I've already forwarded everything Bull Morrison sent me to the FBI director and the Attorney General," she said, her voice steady. "Killing me doesn't stop what's coming, James. You're done." Walsh's expression showed his understanding that the elegant game he'd been playing for years was collapsing, that too many people now knew too much, that his options had reduced to flee or fight. He made his choice, raising his weapon to aim directly at Foster's chest, and in that moment, Dane Hayes's voice echoed across the parking garage. "Federal agent, drop your weapon!" Walsh spun toward the new threat, his tactical training taking over, and found himself facing not just Dane but 20 Hells Angels who'd received Bull's final message and had been racing to protect Agent Foster before Walsh could silence her too. The standoff crystallized into perfect clarity, Walsh and his corrupt team surrounded by bikers who had every reason to kill them, an honest federal agent caught in the middle, and the evidence of systematic corruption spreading through digital networks faster than any violence could contain. Walsh's tactical team looked at each other, performing the instant calculation that their loyalty to Walsh wasn't worth dying for, and slowly lowered their weapons. Walsh stood alone, his weapon still aimed at Foster, his mind working through options that all led to prison or death. "It's over, James," Foster said quietly. "Every email Bull sent is being read by people who can't be bought or intimidated. Your network is collapsing. The cartel will cut ties to protect themselves. Victoria Salazar is probably already on a plane out of the country. You can surrender and take your chances with the system, or you can go down fighting and guarantee your daughter grows up knowing her father died a corrupt cop who murdered good people. Your choice." The mention of his daughter broke through Walsh's calculations, reminding him of the normal life he'd once lived before corruption had consumed him. He lowered his weapon slowly, and in that moment of surrender, Diego Ramirez emerged from the shadows with his uncle Hector's pistol, the weapon Diego had stolen just hours before. "This is for my mother," Diego said, and fired 3 shots into Walsh's chest, the corrupt captain dropping to the parking garage concrete with blood pooling beneath him. The chaos in the parking garage froze for 3 seconds as everyone processed what Diego had just done. A 19-year-old kid had executed a police captain in front of 20 witnesses, including a federal agent. Foster's training took over, her weapon drawn and aimed at Diego even as her mind calculated that this boy had just eliminated the man who'd been about to kill her. "Drop the weapon! Now! Diego Ramirez, put it down!" Diego let the pistol clatter to the concrete, his hands rising slowly, his face showing not fear but the exhausted relief of someone who'd finally completed a task that had consumed him. "My mother Maria was killed by Victoria Salazar 6 months ago as punishment for my uncle's perceived disloyalty," Diego said, his voice steady. "Walsh coordinated it, provided the intelligence about where she worked. I've been waiting for the right moment and this was it. I accept whatever consequences come." Dane approached Diego slowly, his weathered face showing conflicting emotions. This kid had just murdered someone in front of law enforcement, but he'd also saved Foster's life and eliminated a corrupt cop who'd orchestrated Mikey's humiliation. "Kid, you just threw away your life. You're 19 years old. You'll do minimum 25 years for killing a cop, justified or not." Diego met Dane's eyes with surprising composure. "My uncle Hector forced your son to kneel with a knife at his throat. He did that on Victoria's orders, following Walsh's coordination. I've spent 6 months gathering evidence of everything, recordings, documents, financial transfers. Walsh killed my mother. Victoria ordered it. Hector carried out her orders like a puppet. I couldn't save my mother, but maybe I can help destroy the people who took her from me." Foster processed this information with the rapid analysis of someone trained to spot intelligence assets. "You have recordings of Victoria Salazar ordering hits?" Diego nodded. "Hours of them. My uncle kept them as insurance, thinking Victoria wouldn't kill him if he had evidence of her crimes. But insurance only works if people know you have it. I copied everything 3 days ago. It's on a drive hidden in my mother's grave. Victoria ordering hits, Walsh coordinating with the cartel, Hector reporting on operations, everything you'd need to dismantle the entire network. Foster looked at Walsh's body, at the corrupt cop who'd manipulated everyone, and made a decision that would haunt her career but felt absolutely right. Diego, you're going to tell the responding officers that Walsh was about to execute me and you saved my life, which is technically true. Then you're going to cooperate fully with federal authorities, provide every piece of evidence you have, and testify against Victoria Salazar and everyone else involved in your mother's murder. The sirens were already approaching, dozens of them, as Sacramento PD responded to reports of shots fired and an officer down. Dane grabbed Foster's arm urgently. "Agent Foster, we need to talk about what happens next. Bull is dead. Walsh is dead. Kevin betrayed us, and he's probably next on someone's list. Victoria Salazar is the real threat, but she's going to disappear the moment she hears Walsh is gone. We have maybe 2 hours before she vanishes completely." Foster understood the tactical situation with crystalline clarity. Victoria was smart, connected, and had planned escape routes that would take her beyond anyone's reach. The evidence Diego had might be enough to eventually build a case, but eventually didn't matter if Victoria disappeared first. "Where is Victoria right now?" Foster asked. Diego pulled his phone from his pocket, opening a tracking app that showed a pulsing red dot. "I put a GPS tracker in my uncle's car 3 weeks ago. He's with Victoria right now at a property she owns in Elk Grove, about 15 miles from here. They're probably planning their next move, figuring out how to respond to Walsh's death." Foster stared at the phone, at the real-time location of the woman whose organization had taken her daughter 8 years ago, and felt something cold and calculating settle over her. This wasn't about proper procedure or waiting for warrants. This was about justice, revenge, and preventing Victoria from escaping consequences one more time. "I can have a tactical team there in 30 minutes, Foster said, already pulling her radio. But Dane shook his head firmly. "By the time your tactical team gets authorization and gets in position, Victoria will be gone. She's too smart to stay in one place when her network is collapsing. You want her? We go now, fast and hard, before she understands how exposed she is." The suggestion was insane, impossible, completely outside every rule Foster had ever sworn to uphold. Conducting a raid with outlaw bikers instead of federal agents, acting without warrants or oversight, becoming exactly the kind of rogue operator that destroyed careers and sometimes lives. But Foster thought about Emma, about her 8-year-old daughter who'd been taken by this woman's organization, whose body she'd never been able to bury, and she made a choice that prioritized revenge over regulation. "I'm going on record stating this is an emergency tactical situation requiring immediate action to prevent flight of a suspect. You're all deputized as federal informants operating under my supervision. Anything you do is under color of law, and I take full responsibility." It was legal fiction, barely defensible even in the most generous interpretation of federal law enforcement authority, but it gave them cover enough that maybe they could survive the aftermath. Dane didn't waste time acknowledging the insanity of what they were about to do, simply gestured to his brothers who moved toward their motorcycles with the practiced efficiency of people who'd prepared for violence their entire adult lives. Victoria Salazar sat in her Elk Grove safe house reviewing financial transfers on multiple screens, moving money from American banks to offshore accounts with the speed and efficiency of someone who'd planned this escape route years in advance. She'd built Serpiente Cartel from a mid-level regional operation into a major force through careful planning, strategic brutality, and, most importantly, letting men like Hector serve as the visible face of leadership while she operated from shadows. When she'd heard about Walsh's death 20 minutes ago through police scanner traffic, she'd immediately activated evacuation protocols. Her private plane was fueling at a small airfield 30 miles away, her new identity documents were prepared, and by dawn she'd be in a country without extradition treaties, Hector sat across from her, nervous but trusting, still believing they were partners rather than puppeteer and puppet. "Victoria, what happened with Walsh?" "The scanner traffic is saying he was shot by some kid, that the Angels were there, that Agent Foster was involved." Hector's confusion was genuine. He existed in the tactical world of enforcement and violence, while Victoria operated in the strategic realm of manipulation and long-term planning. She'd kept him deliberately ignorant of her deeper games, letting him believe they were equals when he was actually just another disposable asset. "Walsh became a liability," Victoria explained calmly. "He was too ambitious, tried to play too many sides, made himself too visible. His death is actually beneficial. It removes a connection point between us and law enforcement that was becoming dangerous." What she didn't tell Hector was that she'd already made arrangements to eliminate him as well, that the cartel enforcer waiting in the next room had instructions to kill Hector the moment Victoria gave the signal. The sound of motorcycles approaching destroyed the calm efficiency of Victoria's evacuation, the distinctive rumble of Harley engines growing louder until it was impossible to ignore. Hector moved to the window and went pale, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. "We have company. A lot of company. The Angels found us." Victoria's mind raced through calculations. How had they located her so quickly? Who had betrayed her location? What options remained available? She pulled her own weapon from her purse, a small .380 that was accurate enough for close range, and moved toward the back exit she'd ensured existed in every property she owned. "Hector, you're going to stay here and negotiate with them. Buy me 5 minutes to reach my car, and I'll make sure you're compensated for—" She never finished the sentence because Hector's expression had changed from confused to comprehending. "You're leaving me here to die," Hector said flatly, his weapon now pointing at Victoria instead of toward the threat outside. "You were always going to leave me here. My sister Maria died because of your games, and you made me keep working for you through guilt and threats. Diego told me yesterday that he'd figured it out, that you'd ordered Maria's death to keep me in line. I didn't want to believe him. I didn't want to think you were capable of that." Victoria's face showed no emotion, no remorse, just the cold calculation of someone deciding whether Hector was worth the bullet it would take to eliminate him. "Your sister died because she was leverage. You died the moment you pointed that weapon at me. The difference between us, Hector, is that I understand human life is currency, and you're still pretending there are rules." The standoff between Victoria and Hector ended when Agent Foster's voice boomed through a megaphone from outside. "Victoria Salazar, you're surrounded by federal agents and armed citizens. Throw out all weapons and exit with your hands visible. You have 30 seconds to comply before we breach." Victoria knew immediately this was a bluff. No federal tactical team would announce themselves with bikers visible in the background. No legitimate arrest would happen this way. This was vigilante justice dressed in federal authority, and the only real question was whether she could escape through chaos and violence, or whether her carefully constructed empire ended here in this safe house in Elk Grove. She made her decision in the space between heartbeats, her weapon firing 3 times into Hector's chest, the man who'd served her for years dropping to the floor with blood spreading beneath him, his final expression showing not surprise but something that might have been relief. Victoria moved toward her back exit, her mind already calculating routes and timing, when Diego emerged from the hallway she'd thought was clear. "For my mother," Diego said quietly, his weapon, Foster's service pistol that she'd deliberately left accessible, aimed at Victoria's center mass. "For Maria Ramirez. For every person you destroyed while hiding behind men like my uncle. For everyone who trusted you and died because of it." Victoria raised her hands slowly, her weapon dropping to the floor, her face showing the first genuine emotion Diego had seen from her: fear. "Diego, you're a smart boy, smarter than your uncle. We can make a deal. I have money, connections, information about every corrupt official in 3 states. Kill me, and you get revenge, sure, but you spend the rest of your life in prison. Help me escape, and I set you up for life. Give you everything your mother worked 3 jobs trying to provide." Diego's hand didn't waver, his young face showing a hardness that came from losing everything that mattered. "My mother taught me that some things are worth more than money or safety, things like justice, like making sure people face consequences for their choices. You had her killed to control my uncle. You destroyed families across 3 states to build your empire. The money you're offering? It's blood money, paid for by people like my mom who couldn't fight back." Agent Foster entered through the front door with Dane behind her, both weapons drawn, finding Victoria and Diego in a standoff that crystallized everything wrong with how the justice system handled people like Victoria, rich, connected, and protected by layers of corruption that made legitimate prosecution nearly impossible. "Diego, lower the weapon," Foster said, her voice carrying authority despite the insanity of this entire operation. "She's going to face justice. Real justice. Federal prison for the rest of her life. But not like this. Not with you throwing away your future for revenge that won't bring your mother back." Diego's hand trembled, his finger on the trigger, his entire body radiating the tension of someone whose survival had become less important than ensuring the person who'd destroyed his family couldn't hurt anyone else. "She'll escape," Diego said, his voice breaking. "People like her always escape. They have lawyers and connections and ways of making charges disappear. You think she'll really spend life in prison? She'll make deals, she'll trade information, she'll serve maybe 10 years in a comfortable facility and then disappear into witness protection or some country without extradition. My mother is dead, Agent Foster. She's dead because Victoria needed leverage over my uncle. That's not justice. That's just bureaucracy with extra steps." Foster couldn't argue with the truth of what Diego was saying because she'd seen it happen too many times, watched dangerous criminals walk free because they had resources and connections that victims didn't. But she'd also seen what happened to people who took justice into their own hands, how revenge consumed them and left nothing but hollow shells serving life sentences. Dane stepped forward, his presence somehow diffusing the tension through sheer force of weathered authority. "Kid, I get it. My son was forced to his knees in front of our clubhouse with a knife at his throat. I wanted blood, wanted everyone involved to suffer like Mikey suffered. But Bull died tonight because this war escalated beyond anyone's control. Frank Morrison was my best friend for 25 years. He was a father, a veteran, a man who'd found redemption through brotherhood. And he's dead because people like Victoria and Walsh manipulated us all into conflicts they could profit from. You pull that trigger, Diego, and you become just another casualty of their games. You let Agent Foster arrest her, you testify about everything you know, and you give Victoria something she's never experienced in her entire life, criminal life. Actual consequences that she can't buy or kill her way out of." Diego lowered his weapon slowly, the tension draining from his body and leaving him looking like the traumatized 19-year-old he actually was, rather than the calculating executioner he'd been forcing himself to be. Foster moved forward and cuffed Victoria with efficiency, born from 20 years in federal law enforcement, reading her rights in a steady voice, while Victoria's face showed the calculations of someone already planning legal strategies and potential deals. "Victoria Salazar, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, drug trafficking, racketeering, and about 60 other charges we'll be adding as we go through your life. You have the right to remain silent, though I hope you don't because I have questions about what happened to my daughter Emma 8 years ago." The confession came not from guilt or remorse, but from Victoria's final calculation that cooperation might reduce her sentence, her voice clinical and detached as she described operations and deaths as if reading quarterly reports. "Emma Foster was taken by my Los Angeles cell. It was a mistake. They targeted the wrong family. When we discovered the error, eliminating her was the logical choice to prevent future identification. Her body was disposed of in the Angeles National Forest. Grid coordinates I can provide." Foster's hands were shaking as she tightened the cuffs hard enough to leave marks, her professional composure fracturing as the confirmation she'd sought for 8 years finally arrived. "Where exactly?" Foster demanded, her voice breaking. "Where exactly did you put my daughter?" Victoria provided GPS coordinates with the same detachment she'd use for ordering office supplies, and Foster typed them into her phone with trembling fingers, barely able to see the screen through tears that had been building for 8 years. Dane placed one hand on Foster's shoulder, a gesture of shared grief from someone who understood what it meant to have your child endangered by the same violence that defined your life. "We'll find her, Agent Foster. We'll make sure she comes home. And Victoria will spend the rest of her life knowing that her last act of cooperation was the only decent thing she ever did." Victoria's expression showed neither remorse nor satisfaction, just the empty calculation of someone who viewed human life as numbers in a ledger, and Foster understood that no prison sentence could ever truly punish someone who'd long ago abandoned their own humanity. 6 months after the night Victoria Salazar's arrest ended the bloodiest 48 hours in Northern California criminal history, Dane Hayes stood beside Agent Rebecca Foster at a small grave in Angeles National Forest, where Emma Foster's remains had finally been laid to rest. The funeral had been private, just Foster's family and a handful of colleagues who'd never stopped searching. Dane attended because Foster had asked him to, because despite being on opposite sides of the law, they shared the bond of parents who'd had their children endangered by violence neither could fully prevent. "Thank you for coming," Foster said quietly, her eyes on the small headstone that read, "Emma Foster, beloved daughter, 2007 to 2015, finally home." "Thank you for trusting us that night," Dane replied, "for breaking every rule in your book to do what was right instead of what was procedural. Bull would have appreciated that. He always said the best people were the ones who understood that sometimes the rule book gets people killed." Foster managed a small smile despite her grief. "I was fired, you know. Internal Affairs determined my actions that night violated about 40 different regulations. I'll never work in federal law enforcement again." She paused, then added with something that might have been dark humor, "But Victoria Salazar is in a supermax facility serving 9 consecutive life sentences. Diego Ramirez testified against her and received immunity in exchange for cooperation. Captain Walsh's corrupt network was exposed and 17 officers were arrested, so I'd say the trade was worth it." Mikey. Hayes stood at his father's side, the scars on his face from that day 6 months ago still visible but no longer defining him the way they once had. He'd spent 3 months in intensive therapy dealing with the shame and trauma of being forced to kneel, and his therapist, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, had helped him understand that surviving wasn't weakness, that choosing to live rather than seek death through revenge required its own form of courage. "Dad, Mom wants to know if you're coming to dinner tonight," Mikey said, his voice carrying the casual normalcy of someone who'd processed trauma and emerged changed but functional. "She's making that meatloaf you pretend not to like." Dane smiled, despite the gravity of where they stood. Lisa had never remarried, and while they'd never gotten back together romantically, they'd rebuilt a friendship based on shared history and their mutual love for their son. "Tell her I'll be there. And tell her I actually do like the meatloaf. I just give her grief about it because that's our thing." Mikey laughed, and the sound was healing for Dane in ways he couldn't fully articulate. His son had survived, had processed trauma, had chosen to continue living rather than let one brutal moment define his entire existence. That was victory enough. Diego Ramirez worked at a nonprofit helping families of crime victims navigate the justice system, using his experience with Victoria's arrest and trial to guide others through the Byzantine complexity of courts and prosecutors and victim rights. The immunity deal had saved him from prison, but it hadn't saved him from the guilt of killing Captain Walsh or the complicated grief of knowing his Uncle Hector had died that same night. His therapist said the trauma would fade over years. that eventually he'd be able to think about his mother without the crushing weight of her murder overwhelming everything else. Diego hoped that was true, but didn't quite believe it yet. Some wounds were too deep to fully heal. You just learned to walk with the limp they left behind. Marcus Wrench Chen had been voted into full membership of the Hells Angels 3 months after testifying about Kevin's betrayal. His courage in speaking truth, despite knowing the consequences, earning him genuine respect from brothers who valued loyalty above almost everything else. His PTSD from childhood abuse was slowly improving through therapy and medication, and having a chosen family through the club had given him the belonging that his biological family had poisoned through violation and betrayal. He'd never be fully healed, but he was learning that good enough was sometimes the best you could hope for, that functional was better than destroyed, that surviving with scars was victory over the people who'd tried to break you. Kevin Razor Thompson's body had been found 3 days after the Victoria arrest in a drainage ditch outside Reno, executed with a single bullet to the back of the head. The official investigation called it a cartel killing, revenge for his cooperation with law enforcement. The unofficial truth, whispered among angels but never spoken aloud, was that club justice had been served against a traitor who'd sold out the president's son for gambling debts. His daughter Ashley received his life insurance payout and a trust fund that would pay for her college education, the club ensuring that Kevin's sins wouldn't destroy his child's future, even as they couldn't forgive or forget what he'd done. 3 years after Victoria's arrest and Emma's burial, Agent Rebecca Foster published a memoir titled The Long Search: A Mother's Journey Through Corruption and Revenge that became a New York Times bestseller and was optioned for a streaming series. She donated all proceeds to organizations helping families of kidnapping victims, using her platform to advocate for criminal justice reform and greater accountability for law enforcement corruption. Emma's death destroyed me, Foster wrote in the final chapter, but it also showed me that justice isn't always found in courtrooms or delivered through proper channels. Sometimes justice requires breaking rules, forming alliances with people society calls criminals, and accepting that the world is far more complex than we're comfortable acknowledging. Dane Hayes retired from his position as Sacramento Hells Angels chapter president 2 years after the Victoria arrest, passing leadership to a younger generation and stepping back to work as a motorcycle mechanic who rode with his brothers but no longer defined himself solely through the patch on his back. His relationship with Lisa had evolved into something neither romantic nor distant, a partnership based on shared parenting of their adult son and mutual respect for the different people they'd become through decades of living. On the anniversary of Bull's death, Dane visited his friend's grave and left a bottle of Bull's favorite whiskey and a patch from the old days when they'd been young and believed they were invincible. "Miss you, brother," Dane said to the headstone. "Thanks for saving us all one last time. Your sacrifice meant something. I'm making sure of that." Their story serves as a reminder that justice is rarely clean or simple, that sometimes the people we call heroes and villains are separated by circumstances rather than character, and that the most important choices we make are often the ones where we choose restraint over revenge, cooperation over conflict, and healing over hatred. Victoria Salazar will die in prison. Captain Walsh died in a parking garage. Frank Morrison died a hero. Emma Foster is finally home. And the survivors, Dane, Mikey, Foster, Diego, Marcus, they carry their scars and their memories and their guilt and their pride, learning to live in the aftermath of violence that changed them all in ways both devastating and, occasionally, redemptive. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content exploring the impossible choices we face when justice fails and revenge beckons, when the systems designed to protect us become the very things we need protection from, and when ordinary people are forced to become something more or less than human to survive the violence of the world they inhabit. Share this with someone who needs to understand that strength isn't always about fighting, that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose to stop fighting and start healing, and that even in the darkest corners of the criminal world, redemption remains possible for those willing to pay its terrible price.